Putin wanted control, but he got chaos instead. Now he faces a massive Russian youth movement that has begun to turn against him. Putin wanted absolute, unquestionable control over his country. His goal was to build a massive digital panopticon that would monitor every breath, every movement, and every digital trace from Moscow to St. Petersburg, from university lecture halls to bank accounts in Vladivostok. But history always teaches dictators the same ironic lesson. The tighter you grip control, the greater the chaos that slips through your fingers. Within hours, more than 10 regions of Russia were plunged into darkness. This was not just an internet outage, it was the collapse of the country's banking system, air travel, and the foundation of daily life. The .ru domain name system. People rushed to banks but couldn't access their salaries, planes couldn't take off, and e-commerce ground to a halt. At the heart of the crisis was Russia's most dynamic, least controllable, and most angry crowd: university youth. The Kremlin wanted to control these young people with a digital shackle. Russian youth understood exactly what this meant. This was not a communication app, it was a digital conscription certificate. Now all of Russia's youth are turning against the Putin regime. To understand the anatomy of this massive collapse, we must take a closer look at the invisible Trojan horse at the center of events, the Max app. When the Kremlin made this app mandatory for university students to follow their course schedules and access campus announcements, it claimed it was an educational reform. On the surface, it was presented as an announcement and academic coordination tool. Authorities marketed students downloading the app as a national duty and a step towards modernization. However, findings obtained by OSINT analysts and cybersecurity experts who infiltrated databases revealed a much darker picture. Max was not a student assistant, but a KGB agent in your pocket. An examination of the app's source code revealed that the software not only collected academic data, but also scanned the user's GPS location, microphone access, contact list, and even metadata from other encrypted messaging apps. This was an operation to record Russian youth, potential military recruits, and dissident minds in a digital log. It was a North Korea-like control mechanism. It was a digital shackle leading directly to the front lines. The app was a Trojan horse, designed to track the user's GPS location, personal data, and most importantly, their communication network. The intellectual elite in Russia dubbed it the digital draft system. It was a silent, digital pre-preparation for compulsory military service, a kind of conscript profiling system. This imposition triggered a silent resistance movement rather than creating the compliance the regime desired. Students realized that refusing to install Max was a better fate than being trapped on the front lines. According to official reports, installation rates at universities were pitifully low. This silent mutiny delivered the first shock to the Kremlin. The Kremlin activated a typical totalitarian reflex to break this digital resistance: punish everyone. Their goal was to force young people to use the Max app, but the methods they used could be devastating. The aim was to turn young people into data packets and integrate them into the state's surveillance network. What the Kremlin failed to account for, however, was Generation Z's technological literacy. When students discovered the app's backdoors and launched a mass "don't download" and "delete" campaign, the system's first fuse blew. It was at this very point that the crisis transformed from a student protest into a national infrastructure disaster. Roskomnadzor, the Russian censorship agency, panicked and interfered with the .ru domain name system, DNS, in an attempt to cut off student communications and blind signals coordinating potential Ukrainian drone attacks in the region. DNS is the internet's phone book. When you type in a website's name, it directs you to the right server. Russia burned that phone book. The intervention hit Rostelecom's backbone. Just like shutting down the radar of an S-400 battery, the radar of the Russian economy was shut down. All those invisible digital highways where banking systems talk to each other, POS devices get approval, and logistics companies plot routes, were suddenly shut down. This was not a surgical intervention. It was like throwing a grenade into the living room to kill a mosquito. While banking applications displayed connection errors, millions of rubles worth of transfers vanished into the digital void. Gone. Millions of Russians, from Moscow to St. Petersburg, are facing a terrifying nightmare. Because Russia has decided to cut off mobile internet for 24 hours, or perhaps even permanently, in 74 different regions. The symbolic hardest-hit area by this digital blockade was St. Petersburg. The city of 5.6 million people woke up to a digital blackout on Tuesday morning, November 11th. The most striking aspect of the disaster occurred in the Ulyanovsk region. The local government made a shocking decision, announcing that the internet and mobile data would be completely cut off in certain areas until the war ends. In a modern world, cutting off the internet indefinitely in an industrial city is equivalent to draining the lifeblood from its veins. On November 11th, the Ulyanovsk region, with a population of 600,000, implemented its first permanent mobile internet blackout. The Moscow Times report clarifies the situation. This is the first permanent internet outage in the country. A war with no end date in sight, one that even Putin doesn't know when it will end, perhaps lasting for years. And thousands, perhaps millions of people, deprived of the internet until this war ends. And just as these impositions were being made, the communication network collapsed. This decision was less a technical necessity than an admission of the regime's desperation and state of panic. Factories, supply chains, and civilian life in Ulyanovsk were trapped in the analog world of the 1980s. But this time, instead of typewriters, they had non-functioning smartphones. History does not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. The scene we see today on the streets of St. Petersburg brutally recalls the deepest trauma in the collective memory of the Russian people, the winter of 1990 to 91. Just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the final days of the Gorbachev era, there were miles-long queues on the streets of Moscow and Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. People were waiting in the freezing cold, not for ideology, but for the most basic necessities: cigarettes, vodka, and a loaf of bread. What brought down the regime that day was not Western nuclear missiles or NATO expansion. It was the deep sense of deprivation and humiliation by the state experienced by the people. Today, in 2025 Russia, Vladimir Putin is making his people experience the same humiliation again, this time in a digital package. ATM queues are the modern digital version of those famous bread queues of 1990. However, there is a vital difference between these two queues that will determine the Kremlin's fate: the profile of those waiting. Those waiting in the lines of 1990 were weary from decades of Soviet propaganda, accustomed to submitting to the system, patient and grey. For them, scarcity was part of life. But those waiting in today's bank-run lines are not patient Soviet citizens. These lines are filled with an angry Generation Z, whose smartphones, their only connection to the world, have been taken away, whose money has been seized, and whose freedoms have been interfered with. Putin likes to describe the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Ironically, however, he has recreated the atmosphere of scarcity, queues, and chaos that led to that catastrophe with his own hands and in his own capital. Moreover, this time the stage is St. Petersburg, historically the cradle of revolutions and uprisings. In 1905, 1917, and 1991, the spark of change always came from this city, from the banks of the Neva River. Moscow is the city of power and bureaucracy. St. Petersburg is the city of spirit and resistance. Putin's Soviet generation television party, the elderly crowd numbed by propaganda, may not care if the internet goes away. For them, life consists of the fairy tales told on Solovyov's evening shows. But for the younger generation, whom we might call the refrigerator and internet party, the internet is as vital as oxygen. When their refrigerators are empty and their screens go dark, the state's authority collapses. Putin didn't just cut off the internet in St. Petersburg, he awakened this city's rebellious spirit from a dangerous slumber. To stop a handful of Ukrainian drones, Putin broke his own country's digital backbone. This was not just a technical error, it was a digital war declared by the state against its own people. Throughout his rule, Putin has always viewed two things as enemies: Western-backed political opposition and youth with high potential for organization and technological mastery. That's why he imprisoned Navalny. That's why he repeatedly tried to ban Telegram, and now he has made his most reckless move yet to bring that youth entirely under his surveillance network. The analysis is straightforward. Why is a university coordination app being imposed so aggressively during a period when military mobilization poses the highest risk? Because the Kremlin wanted to track where students were, who they were talking to, and how long they were active. This app had the capability to digitally sign off on summoning thousands of students to the front lines overnight, if deemed necessary. So how does a regime so recklessly, so amateurishly jeopardize its own future? There is a one-word answer to this question: panic. Putin's panic turned into a decision that targeted not only students, but the country's entire communications network. And this decision dynamited the country's economic and social structure. On November 16, 2025, much of Russia, starting with the Donetsk region and spreading deep into Russia, was shaken by widespread internet outages. The rationale behind these outages was interpreted as an attempt to hinder communication and prevent coordination in the face of potential attacks by Ukrainian drones. From a military standpoint, you restrict the communication network to enhance airspace security. However, there was one reality that Putin forgot or deliberately ignored. A modern economy cannot function without the internet. According to the Moscow Times, the mass outage of .ru domain names stemmed from weaknesses in Russia's sovereign internet system. This outage did not just mean that websites were down. It meant that a country's financial backbone was paralyzed. Money transfers stopped, ATMs went offline, people couldn't withdraw cash, salary payments couldn't be made. This directly hit ordinary Russian citizens who received their salaries digitally and managed their daily lives through mobile banking. Putin's 20-year promise of stability was instantly shattered by the equation no cash equals no peace. Flights and train services cannot operate without instant communication and coordination. Air transport stopped, rail logistics faltered. Now, the state panicked and cut off the internet, completely crippling the already poor economy. Putin's allies and technocrats were left in a bind. While they tried to salvage the situation with technical terms, Putin nullified all their efforts with a single panic button. Control has slipped from Putin's hands on both the economic and digital fronts. Putin and his allies believe that cutting off the internet is a means of control. But history and geopolitics have proven the opposite. Communication blackouts do not reduce anger. On the contrary, they provoke and radicalize. To analyze this, we must look at the 2020 protests in Belarus, Russia's closest ally. The Lukashenko regime cut off the internet to suppress the protests. Analyses in Western media showed that this disruption initially made it difficult for protesters to organize. But what was the result? When communication is cut off, people don't know what's going on. This uncertainty leads to the spread of rumors and worst-case scenarios. Rumors like, tanks are coming, or banks are permanently closed, push people into the streets rather than pacifying them. People are angry not just because of a political opinion, but because their daily life rights, like withdrawing money or talking to family, have been taken away. This draws even apolitical people into the streets. In Belarus, the communication blackout did not send protesters home. On the contrary, it angered them further and forced them to organize using different methods. Putin has activated precisely this Belarusian model backlash in his own country. With the collapse of the internet, the average Russian citizen now thinks, the state cannot protect me from Ukraine, it cannot protect my money, it is trying to forcibly conscript my child, and it is taking away my most basic right, my right to communication. When these four elements come together, Putin's stability and prosperity contract with his people is completely over. Putin built his power on the slogan, "I ended the chaos of the 90s." Now, with his own policies, he is bringing back the chaos of the 90s. As a result, this collapse is no longer an abstract economic crisis. It is on the verge of a social explosion. Putin's obsession with control has led him to dynamite the foundations of his own power. Putin's plan for control has pulled the plug on his own empire. It has crippled the banking system and driven a generation to rebellion. The picture is now clear. While Putin is trying to win the war in Ukraine, he is beginning to lose in the streets and digital networks of Russia. Putin has turned the brightest, most educated, and most angry generation of university students against him. By imposing the Max app, he sent them the message, "We will draft you." The youth responded with a resounding, "No." This is the Kremlin's most long-term and difficult problem to solve. If a regime attempts to control the generation that represents its future through oppression and deception, sooner or later, it will fall victim to a digital uprising. Elvira Nabiullina and other technocrats are desperately seeking technical solutions to keep the economy afloat. But Putin's single, panic decision has nullified all their efforts. The central bank governor's confessions and the collapse of the .ru domain name show that Putin has put even his own allies in a difficult position. This situation deepens the cracks within the Kremlin and shakes confidence in Putin. The Russian people are now comparing propaganda with their own reality. Propaganda says, everything is stable. Reality says, banks have collapsed, there is no cash, there is no communication. This digital paralysis showed ordinary citizens that the state cares only about the war, not itself. Ukraine is no longer seen as responsible for inflation, conscription, and economic paralysis. The Kremlin itself is now seen as the culprit. Putin cut off communication networks to control his country, but this not only ignited the fuse of civil unrest, it also destroyed the last shreds of trust in the eyes of the Russian people. This is not an interruption. This is the regime's plug being pulled. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.